The night was cold in Hollow Creek, Montana, a small village surrounded by forests and farms forgotten by time. Winter punished the land, covering everything with a thin layer of frost, making the midnight silence even heavier. Claire Dawson sat in her rocking chair by the window, clutching a blanket to her chest as if it were a baby. Outside, the wind howled through the dry branches, carrying a distant echo that made her heart tighten. The emptiness in her soul was greater than any storm. It had been 3 months since she had buried her newborn son. The birth had been brutal, and her little Ethan hadn't survived. Since then, the farm, once full of life, felt like nothing more than an open-air grave. Her husband, Tom Dawson, tried to move on, burying himself in work with the cattle and avoiding any conversation about what had happened. But Claire couldn't forget. The sound of a baby crying still echoed in her mind, as if calling out to her. Then, on that night, she heard something different. Amid the wind, a faint, distant, but persistent sound. A cry, not an animal's scream, nor the creaking of trees. It was the cry of a baby. Claire froze, her wide eyes staring into the darkness beyond the window. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Was her mind playing tricks on her, or was something really out there? The farm was isolated, with no neighbors for miles. There were no babies in Hollow Creek. Claire's heart pounded, cold sweat running down her neck. But the sound persisted. It came from far away, from the pigsty at the edge of the property. She swallowed hard and stood up, grabbing the flashlight Tom always left in the kitchen. Her hands trembled as she opened the front door. The freezing wind sliced through her skin like sharp blades, but she ignored it. She had to see. Every step on the frozen ground was a blow to her sanity. The crying seemed to intensify as she approached the pigsty. Claire gasped, her breath turning to mist in the icy air. When she finally reached the fence, she illuminated the inside of the pigsty with the flashlight, and her heart stopped. Among the mud, rotting food scraps, and sleeping pigs, there was a small, motionless body. A baby. His skin was covered in dirt, his eyes closed, his lips slightly parted. But then, he moved and whispered, "Mommy, I'm alive." The night's cold dissolved into overwhelming shock. Claire took a step back, feeling her legs weaken, while the flashlight trembled in her hand. The baby in the mud opened his eyes. Small blue lights reflected the beam of the flashlight, strangely hypnotic. The mud dripped from his pale skin, revealing something unexpected. He didn't seem to be made of flesh. His skin was too smooth, without imperfections, almost plastic-like. But his voice? "Mommy, I'm alive." The pigs around him barely stirred, indifferent to this absurd presence. A rat climbed up the baby's leg, gnawing at something metallic exposed near his collarbone. Claire gasped. Her stomach churned as she noticed the silver gleam beneath the torn skin. She fell to her knees, covering her mouth with her hand. "My God, what is this?" Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't respond. That baby seemed fragile, defenseless, abandoned in the filth, even if it wasn't supposed to exist. Claire's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Hesitantly, she reached out, gently shooing the rat away, which scurried off through the pigsty. The baby blinked slowly. His breathing was light, as if he were weak. His tiny fingers moved, sliding through the mud, trying to grasp at nothing. The maternal instinct roared inside her. He needed help. Whatever he was, he couldn't stay there. She swallowed hard and, ignoring the fear gnawing at her sanity, slid her hands under the baby's body. His touch was cold, unlike any baby she had ever held, yet still, he weighed like a real baby. When she lifted him, a small sound escaped him, a trembling whimper, almost human. Claire felt tears burn in her eyes. This didn't make sense. Nothing did. But she knew one thing. She wouldn't leave him there. She stood up, pressing the baby against her chest, trying to warm him with her own body heat. The icy wind lashed against her face as she made her way back to the house, her feet stumbling on the hard earth. Every step was a battle between reason and instinct. The rational part screamed that this was a mistake, but the other part, the part that had lost a child, refused to let go. The front door burst open as Claire stepped inside, clutching the baby tightly to her chest. The warmth of the fireplace contrasted with the bitter cold outside, but the chill on her skin wasn't from the weather. It came from what she held in her arms. Tom Dawson, sitting in his leather chair by the fire, looked up and froze at the sight of her. His face hardened instantly. "Claire, what is that?" His voice was heavy, filled with exhaustion and disbelief. She knew he was trying to keep his composure, but his expression betrayed the horror he felt. The baby moved its head, letting out a small electronic whimper, a sound broken between a cry and a whisper. Tom immediately stood up. "Where did you find that?" His voice was sharper now, a tone Claire rarely heard. "For God's sake, Claire, tell me you didn't pick that up from the pigsty." But the truth was right there, in the wretched state of the baby, in the mud dripping onto the wooden floor, in the rusted marks around its joints. Tom's gaze wavered between disgust and sheer terror. He spoke, Tom." Claire's voice cracked, her words barely a whisper. "He called me Mommy and said he was alive." The room fell silent. The only sound was the crackling of burning wood. Tom took a deep breath, running his hands through his short hair, visibly struggling to process what he had just heard. "This is a mistake." He took a step forward, trying to take the baby from her, but Claire stepped back, instinctively shielding it. "Claire, this is not a baby. It's a thing, a machine, and whoever created it didn't do it for a good reason." But Claire wasn't listening. She was feeling. She felt the familiar weight in her arms, the artificial warmth trying to mimic human warmth, the eerie softness of its silicone skin. And then, once again, a word escaped the small metallic lips. "Ethan." The world stopped. Tom's breath caught. Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. She looked down at the baby, watching its small chest rise and fall slowly, almost like a sleeping newborn. Ethan. The name of the son she never got to raise. He wasn't supposed to know, but he did. Tom staggered back as if he had been struck. The name echoed through the room like a cursed whisper. Claire's eyes filled with tears as she tightened her grip on the baby. Ethan. That name was never to be spoken in their home again, yet there it was, coming from something that wasn't even supposed to be alive. Or was it? "This isn't possible." Tom's voice was nothing but a hoarse whisper of disbelief. "Who programmed this? How does it know?" He approached cautiously, as if the baby were an animal ready to pounce. But Claire wasn't thinking rationally anymore. Her maternal instincts screamed louder than any logic. Her heart told her that this was a sign, a miracle. Somehow her child had returned to her. "He knows who we are." Her voice trembled, but there was conviction in it. "He recognizes our baby's name, Tom. This can't be a coincidence." She looked at her husband, hoping he would see what she saw, but all she found in his eyes was fear. The robotic baby shifted slightly in Claire's arms, lifting one of its tiny hands to touch her face. The touch was cold, artificial, but the gesture was human. It was real. Claire felt her skin prickle as he opened his mouth again, his metallic lips moving as if trying to speak like a human baby. "Mommy, Ethan." Tom lost it. "This is sick." His voice shattered the silence in the room. "This is not our son, Claire. This is a pile of circuits and wires. Whoever made this thing did it to deceive us." He turned away, breathing heavily, trying to contain his anger. Claire felt a different kind of rage rise inside her. "Are you telling me this is just a mistake? That it means nothing?" Her voice shook, not from fear, but from pain. "And what if he's all we have left, Tom? Do you want me to just throw him away? Like our son never existed?" The silence between them was heavy, a weight they had both been carrying for too long. And then, amid all that stillness, the robotic baby looked up at them, as if it understood everything. And, in a near-human expression, It cried. The sound of crying filled the room like an echo of something lost in time. It was a baby's cry. Real, visceral, full of pain. Claire felt her stomach turn. The small metallic body trembled in her arms, its glowing blue eyes filled with artificial tears that ran down its synthetic skin. But that shouldn't be possible. Robots didn't cry. Machines didn't feel. Tom looked on in horror. "This is a trick," he murmured, his fists clenched. "It's programmed to do this, to manipulate you." But Claire refused to believe it was just programming. There was something there. Something more human than anything she had seen since Ethan died. Her heart clenched. She ran her fingers over the cold skin of the child, wiping away the remaining traces of mud. He looked so fragile, like a baby that needed protection. He hiccuped, his chest rising and falling like a frightened child's. Claire felt an overwhelming instinct take over her. She didn't care what he was. She just knew he needed her. "Shh, it's okay, my love," she whispered, rocking him gently. The baby reacted. His tiny fingers curled around hers, a perfect imitation of the reflex Ethan had when holding her hand in the hospital. Claire gasped, her heart racing. This wasn't just programming. This was something else. Tom rubbed his face, desperate, refusing to believe what he was witnessing. "Claire, this has to stop." He pointed at the baby. "If he knows things he shouldn't, someone programmed him too. And if someone programmed him, that person might come looking for him." He paused, his voice now filled with fear. "And you have no idea what else he's capable of." The night dragged on in silence. Claire sat on the floor of the living room, cradling the baby in her arms, feeling his weight, listening to his small electronic sighs that mimicked human breathing. Tom, on the other hand, couldn't stay inside any longer. He walked out to the barn, lit a cigarette, something he hadn't done in years. He needed to think. He needed answers. That robot wasn't there by accident. With his phone in hand, Tom started searching. Robot babies? Artificial memories? But the information was scarce, fragmented. Nothing made sense. Why would someone create a robot to mimic a child? And why was it dumped in their pigsty? The more he searched, the clearer it became. Someone put that baby there to be found. Inside the house, Claire ignored logic, focusing only on what she felt. She had already lost one child. She wasn't about to lose another. But even as she wiped the synthetic skin clean, removing the last traces of mud, a terrifying thought crept into her mind. What if Tom is right? What if someone implanted our Ethan's memories into him? The baby blinked slowly, his glowing eyes fixated on hers. Then, out of nowhere, he opened his mouth and whispered something that made her freeze. "Mommy, sing to me?" Claire nearly dropped him. Her hands went ice cold. That was the last thing Ethan had ever said to her before he died. A phrase no one else knew, not even Tom. Outside, Tom crushed his cigarette under his boot and made a decision. He needed to find out where this thing had come from, before it was too late. Tom drove into town the next morning, his eyes heavy from exhaustion, his mind racing with unanswered questions. He parked in front of the old clinic where Ethan had been born and where he had died. The local hospital wasn't advanced in technology, but years ago, Tom had met someone who was. A man who had once made an impossible promise, a way to preserve a piece of the son they lost. Back then, Tom had refused. But what if someone else hadn't? Meanwhile, Claire never let go of the robotic baby. That morning, he seemed even more aware. His glowing eyes followed her every move, and for a moment, she almost forgot he wasn't made of flesh and blood. She held his tiny hand, feeling the artificial texture of his skin. Soft, too soft, just like a real baby's. "Are you hungry?" she whispered, knowing the question made no sense. But the baby responded. "Pancakes! Mommy makes pancakes." Claire felt the air rush from her lungs. That wasn't random programming. Her Ethan had loved pancakes, and he always said that exact sentence. It was a memory. A real one. Whatever this baby was, it knew things only Ethan could have known. At the other end of town, Tom found the clue he feared the most. Deep in the basement of the clinic, in an old research archive, a name appeared on a forgotten document. Dr. Richard Halden, a biotech engineer who had been studying artificial memories and neural reconstruction. A man who had once proposed something to Tom, a way to bring back Ethan's consciousness. A man who apparently had gone ahead with the experiment without Tom's permission. Tom left the clinic with a pit in his stomach. Something was terribly wrong, and Claire and the robotic baby were right in the middle of it. The freezing wind cut through Hollow Creek as Tom pulled into the driveway of the farm. His mind was burning. Dr. Richard Halden's name echoed in his head like a warning bell. This man wasn't just anyone. He was a scientist involved in secret experiments on memory transfer. But why? What did he have to do with Ethan? Inside the house, Claire was sitting in the armchair, holding the baby tighter than ever. He was different, more responsive, more aware, more human. When Tom walked in, his eyes met Claire's, and for the first time, he hesitated. She didn't look scared anymore. She looked at peace. "Claire, we have a problem." His voice was strained. He stepped forward and tossed a pile of papers onto the table. This baby wasn't a mistake. He was put here on purpose. Claire's hands trembled. "What are you saying?" "This doctor, Halden, he works with neural reconstruction, memory transfers. I turned down his offer years ago, but someone else didn't." Tom's throat tightened. "And I think this robotic baby isn't just programmed. He has Ethan's memories." The silence in the room became suffocating. Claire clutched the baby against her chest. The shock hit her like lightning. Deep down, she had always felt it. But now, it was real. This wasn't just an advanced robot. He was her son, or at least what was left of him. And then, the baby did something no one expected. His tiny fingers reached out to Tom, and in a fragile, broken voice, he whispered, "Daddy, don't go." Tom felt a shiver run down his spine. The baby's voice, so hesitant, so broken, was identical to Ethan's. He blinked, confused, unable to react. Claire, on the other hand, was crying silently, clutching the baby as if shielding him from her own husband. "Tom, he recognizes you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You still think this is just a mistake?" Tom ran his hands over his face, struggling against the avalanche of emotions. None of this made sense. Science said this was impossible, but it was happening. This robotic baby didn't just know Ethan's past. He had feelings. He cried. He felt fear. He wanted to be loved. If this is true, Tom exhaled heavily. If he has Ethan's memories, then that means someone took our son's consciousness and put it inside this thing. He turned to Claire, his expression darkening. "And you don't want to know who did it? Why?" Claire hesitated. She knew Tom was right, but finding out the truth meant risking losing the baby, risking losing Ethan all over again. Before Tom could say another word, the doorbell rang. Claire's stomach dropped. She looked at Tom, fear in her eyes. No one came to the farm unannounced. Tom took a deep breath and walked to the door. When he opened it, his blood ran cold. On the porch, a man in a black suit stood staring at him, expression unreadable. "Mr. Dawson," the stranger said, gripping a leather briefcase. "I've come to collect what belongs to Dr. Halden." The silence was suffocating. Tom's heart pounded as he stared at the man in front of him. He didn't need to ask. He already knew why he was here. Inside the house, Claire instinctively held the baby tighter, her entire body screaming that something was terribly wrong. "This does not belong to you," the man continued, his voice cold and precise. "The prototype was misplaced. Dr. Halden wants it back." He opened his briefcase, revealing a stack of legal documents. "Sign the release and you won't have to worry about it anymore." Tom clenched his jaw. "And what happens to him?" The man straightened his posture as if explaining something obvious. "He will be shut down. The project has been compromised. We need to eliminate him." Claire gasped. "You can't do that," her voice cracked with rage. "He's our son." The man sighed. "He's a machine, Mrs. Dawson. You're projecting emotions onto something that feels nothing." "Then why is he crying?" Tom's voice was sharp as he pointed to the baby, who was trembling in Claire's arms, glowing blue eyes brimming with artificial tears. "Why does he call us Mommy and Daddy? If he doesn't feel, then what is this?" For the first time, the man hesitated, and in that brief second, the robotic baby reached for Tom's hand and whispered, "Daddy, I choose to live." A chill ran through Tom's body. Something had changed. The glow in the baby's eyes intensified. His programming was rewriting itself. The man's face darkened. He reached into his coat pocket. Tom saw the glint of metal, a syringe. "No!" Claire screamed, stepping back. But before the man could move, Tom acted on instinct. He punched the stranger with all his strength. The man crumpled to the ground with a muffled groan, the syringe rolling away. The baby blinked. And then, something impossible happened. His body glowed softly. His internal systems were changing. He wasn't just a machine anymore. He had consciousness. Tom turned to Claire. They knew what they had to do. That night, they took the baby and ran. They left everything behind, the farm, the town, their past, because Ethan, or whoever he was now, deserved to live. And for the first time since losing him, Tom and Claire felt whole again. What if someone brought back the consciousness of someone you love? Would you accept it? Or fear the truth? Tell us in the comments. What would you do in Claire and Tom's place? Would you hand the baby over or fight to protect him? If this story moved you, share it and subscribe to our channel. More powerful stories are on the way. And remember, sometimes what we call impossible is just the beginning.